everyone, and welcome to another episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Ali Roden, and I'm the digital media producer here at Seed World Group. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be your host. Last week on Seed Speaks, you heard two specialists discuss seed sampling and testing. This week, we're tackling the topic of soil sampling. To help us learn more, we've got two fantastic panelists joining us: Anita Renwick, agronomist and owner of A1 Agronomy, and John Breker, soil scientist at AGVISE Laboratories. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. Let's start with some introductions. Can you tell us some more about yourself, Anita? Oh, I think you're on mute, Anita.
Sorry, yes, I was. Hello, yes, so my name is Anita Renwick. I run an independent agronomy-based business in Southwest Manitoba, located out of Melita, where we specialize in soil sampling. Soil fertility is really our predominant focus, and other agronomy-based activities with local producers.
Awesome. And John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is John Breker. I'm a soil scientist with AGVISE Laboratories out of Northwood, North Dakota. And from our laboratory here, we take soil samples like Anita collects. They send them to us, and we actually analyze, test them, and deliver those soil test results back to agronomists and farmers so they can actually use that data to make informed nutrient management decisions. So from our Northwood location, we actually work all the way across the Canadian prairies as well, because we have a receiving facility in Winkler, Manitoba. So that allows us to turn around soil test results in a prompt and timely fashion so people can use them for fall fertilizer applications and other things that we're thinking about as harvest is kind of getting underway, depending where you're at, or starting to wrap up. And we think about planning for next year's crop.
Awesome. So I wanted to start off with some basics to kind of give our audience some background on the topic. So Anita, let's start with you. What are the benefits of soil sampling?
Largely, what we see as seeing some of the most predominant benefits of having a soil sampling program in place on farm is that it takes all of the guesswork out of trying to build a plan with the producer. So it gives us a starting point for what is left over after a growing season, after any given crop in that year. And it just, like I said, it really gives us a starting point as far as, we know what is left over after that growing season. We've got all the details as far as what that growing season was like. And then we can sit down and start to make some more specific planning decisions as far as fertilizer booking, fertilizer purchase goes, working with their specific implements and how to go about getting the appropriate amount of specific fertilizers in place to ensure that they've got the best plan in place to achieve a specific yield. So I think that's just the biggest thing for us, is it gives us a very specific starting point and it takes the guesswork out of everything.
Awesome. John, would you like to add anything to that?
I mean, Anita did a really good job of outlining the purpose of it. And there's kind of two competing aspects to nutrient management. You want to apply enough of a particular nutrient to maximize crop yield. For example, nitrogen. You want to make sure that you apply enough nitrogen to maximize that crop yield, prevent any nutrient deficiencies that might be a limiting factor. But at the same time, you don't want to apply excess nutrients, because it's, one, an extra cost that you didn't need to incur, but also you don't want to leave extra nitrogen vulnerable in the environment to potential losses, whether it be nitrate leaching or denitrification that could have undue environmental consequences. So soil testing is really that tool that we use to, one, figure out how much of that particular nutrient is already present in soil. Two, how much do we need to add to maximize our return, but also without causing undue economic losses or environmental issues because of that. So it's really the nutrient management tool that kind of fits in there to let us know what we have. And then I'm sure, as we'll get into this conversation focusing on soil sampling, the difference between whole field composite sampling and grid or zone sampling, about how to use this kind of, I'll say, a simple tool of just collecting the soil sample and seeing what it contains, and starting to parse that out across the field so we can actually pinpoint those nutrients to the right parts of the landscape.
Awesome. That was a great overview. Thank you guys. So, John, what are the different sampling methods that AgVISE uses in their labs, and how do you determine which one is best suited for the soil?
So, so there's kind of two things to tease out here. Now, there's the soil sampling methods where there we would talk about the actual sample collection in the field. And then there's also the soil testing methods, the actual methods that we would use in the laboratory. And I think you're going to want me to comment on that second part. So depending where you're at in the world, within the North American continent, different regions have different soil testing methods, and they are geared to teasing out the aspects of that particular nutrient's availability. And probably a really good one to look at is phosphorus, for example. So in this region, we have the North Central Soil Testing Committee, which is comprised of university researchers who have agreed and come up with approved methods for soil testing. And those methods are geared towards the specific types of crops and soils that you grow in an area. So for phosphorus, for example, the approved method for like where Anita and I are here in North Dakota and Manitoba, we have the 49th parallel that runs between us, but the crops and soils between these areas are very similar. So the Olson phosphorus test method is the most commonly used phosphorus method for this region because it better reflects phosphorus availability in what are largely high pH soils. If we went to the eastern US, or I should say more so into the Corn Belt and farther to the south, they start to use different phosphorus extractants like the Bray phosphorus method. And that is in part due to the soils, but also in part due to the actual local regional calibration data. So whenever you're looking at a lab and trying to find the right soil test methods, kind of the important questions to ask are, is that method suitable for your local soils? And also, has that soil test method been calibrated for the crops that you're growing? And thirdly, if they actually have local calibration data to convert that soil test result to a usable fertilizer recommendation at the end of the day.
Awesome. Thank you, John. And Anita, do you want to kind of touch on the first point that John made about the methods that you use collecting that soil in the fields?
Sure, yes. So here we basically can do two different types of soil sampling programs. So as John kind of alluded to there, one of the programs that we work with a fair bit is still more of a composite style program. So what that entails is on a field scale basis, we go out and we collect soil in areas of the field that largely represent what would be considered a mid-slope area of the field. So we are avoiding absolute low spots and the tops of hills, just to not skew that data. But we are going out there and we are taking a representative sample of the mid-slope and generally the most comprehensive average area of the field per se, and using that information for producers that are still, say they're broadcast applying or blanket applying. And when I say that, I just mean that with the equipment that they're using, they don't yet have the ability to fluctuate a rate of application throughout that field. So they load up their equipment before they start that field, and then they would blanket apply the same rate across that whole field. So that is why we just take one set of data from across that whole field. Another way that we are doing it, as for producers that have higher technological capabilities with their equipment, is more of a zone-based sampling program. So we actually use a program called Swap Maps here, but essentially what that does is it delineates zones across a field. And so when we're looking at what makes up those zones, largely it's soil characteristics. So it'll split out higher and drier areas of the field versus lower and wetter, and everything in between. It largely correlates to water holding capacity and how water would move through that field. And then what we end up with is multiple sets of data as far as the soil test result goes. So then we can make a more in detail plan for the producer specific to each of the nutrients across the whole field, and not so much on an average basis addressing a field in one way. So the the SWOT maps zone-based approach is really a much more comprehensive way to go about it, and it just helps fine-tune those decisions again, because we do see quite a big range as far as, even we'll just use nitrogen or residual nitrate as an example. But we can see even quite a big difference across a whole field in one specific nutrient. So it does make a lot of sense to look at a program like that if a producer has equipment that is capable of applying it in that way.
And Anita, when should soil samples be taken, and is that timeline important?
Yes, for sure. So that is a good question. We like to time all of our soil sampling basically post-harvest. So later in the season, and John can probably speak to this a little bit as well, but we do have to wait for the crop to come off, and then at that point we will start sampling. Generally, we wait until the first part of September, when the temperatures overall are a little bit lower than they would be earlier in the season. If we have fall applied, or I should say fall seeded crops, then we're generally trying to just time that as close as we can to when they're going to go back in and seed those crops. But as far as taking samples in the fall, to use them for building plans over the winter and then coming in and seeding those fields in the spring, basically any time after the combines have rolled out of the field, there's generally not enough change to warrant, say, waiting until, say, later November or that kind of thing. On average, it still is wise to just go ahead as soon as the combine's out of the field. Yeah, and then the later that you get into the fall and the soil temperatures keep dropping, sorry, then yeah, it's fair game to just go ahead.
Awesome. And John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, as Anita said, right after the combines come out is really a good time to start getting out there and collect your soil samples for kind of two reasons, especially for residual nitrate. One, it gives you a really good chance to see how much nitrogen was left over from that crop. So it gives you a good reflection of seeing how you did for nitrogen management following that crop. But the second part, and this is always the most important part, is getting that data ready for planning for next year. There's a couple aspects why getting sampling right after the combines roll is important, and one is sample quality. Um, if you're in an area that does any kind of fall tillage, like you would find farther to the east, um, after chisel plows have been through a field, it's really tough to get good quality soil samples, especially for the top 0 to 6 inch depth. So any soil nutrient that's analyzed on that topsoil, whether it be phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients like zinc or copper, tillage makes it much more difficult for that person in the field to get a good consistent depth. So making sure that you get those samples collected before any fall tillage is very important. Where Anita's at in kind of western Manitoba, like it's more no-till, so you don't have to run into that fall tillage aspect. But the other part about getting samples collected sooner is you have the data on hand so you can actually make decisions with it, because you never know what's going to happen with weather. If we get an early snowstorm, if we start getting into some rain, and we have seen falls like that where I'm thinking of 2018, 2019, be very, very wet, very late. And so then that ends up pushing a bunch of sampling activity into the spring, because through the middle of winter we freeze up and you can't actually take soil samples. And then you have this very truncated spring where you're trying to get everything collected in the spring. So getting stuff sampled in the fall is always my recommendation, because you actually have the data on hand to make decisions with. And considering fertilizer prices right now, it's going to take some time to make your fertilizer purchase decisions, figure out what crops you exactly want to grow, because right now commodity prices are still quite positive for many crops. So people have many options on the table as far as what they want to grow, what they want to fertilize for. So at least if you have that soil test data on hand now, you can use that information for making an informed decision as you move forward into next spring.
And what do you look for in the soil to determine what changes need to be made in the field? And John, we can start with you, and then Anita can close us out on that question.
So I would say probably, the three most principal nutrients would be nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And based on those soil test results and what your crop choice is, how you're planning on fertilizing that, yield goals, you'll have different target nutrient guideline amounts that you're going to be shooting for. So that's kind of the first place to start, is figuring out how much fertilizer that you'll actually need to grow that crop. Um, as far as other things, if you have high salinity, maybe you have soils that have low organic matter, maybe you have some erosion issues that are continually an issue, and maybe you have low phosphorus levels year after year. In part, that might be because you have some erosion issues that's blowing away your soil and your nutrients every time the wind blows. Or it could be a case that maybe with the phosphorus rate that you're putting on, you're not building because crop yield potential's gone up and your crop removal is so high from year to year that you're not really gaining any extra traction. So when you start looking at soil test results from year to year, when you work with an agronomist or a certified crop advisor, they can point out some of these things, like, what are some of our goals that we want to achieve with soil management? And, they can definitely highlight some things that give you a direction to shoot for. And then with soil testing, you can see if you are actually building phosphorus levels, or if you're building soil organic matter into the future.
Awesome. Anita, do you have anything to add?
I think John did a really good job of explaining that part. The only thing I would really add is that, again, yeah, like looking at the macronutrients, so NPK and S, depending on the crop choices that the producer is considering. And it's always a good idea to just take a look at what else may be there as far as micronutrients in that regard. Generally less of an issue where we are situated, but we do have some pockets where that could affect things. And yeah, just seeing basically what is there when you're sitting down and making a plan as far as crop rotation goes, and how do we want to allocate our resources as far as the budget this year. What makes the most sense as far as if we have a limited amount of dollars to spend. So where does it make the most sense? And then in flipping that a little bit is, if we're sticking to that, then we can understand better, what a potential outcome might be if we can only, we're only going to put so much in specific areas. So again, it just gives that piece of information to understand what's going on, kind of big picture.
Awesome. And I think that we have an audience question that would fit really nicely in the conversation from Alex Martin Hahn. If you find there's anything wrong with your soil and soil health, what are your recommendations for starting to improve? And either one of you, whoever wants to take a stab at it first.
I would say the first thing is, what's your problem? Because soil health itself, I mean, it's a term that gets used a lot, but because it gets used a lot, a lot of the nuance of what is soil health to you gets lost in the message. So that's where I like to focus on the exact kind of problems that you have. Is it a soil salinity issue? Do you have a soil erosion issue? Do you have drainage problems? And depending on what those specific problems are, because usually they're soil management oriented type questions, or maybe it's compaction, things like that. You got to focus on that particular issue and then try to address the solution for that, because depending on the problem, the solutions are different. Like if you got salinity, it's all about water management and crop choice. So after you've chosen some of the more salt tolerant crops, whether it be barley, you've already done that, but you still have issues, then you got to think about improving drainage somehow. Does that mean tile drainage? Does that mean targeted water management in a different way? As well as, in some cases, you might have a soil that you can't do much else with, and you have to think about alternative land use, which is usually the last thing we want to do. But that's also an option that some people have to consider in some cases.
Awesome. Anita, do you have anything else?
I think John did an excellent job.
Awesome. So I know you guys, since you start sampling in the fall, you've probably kind of just started collecting those samples and sending them to the lab. So far, has there been any soil issue that you've been seeing in kind of mass amounts that growers can look out for?
One thing I would point out that's different this year from last year. Last year, 2021, was a huge drought, lower crop yields, and there was lots of nitrogen left over. This spring, we had quite a bit of moisture. We recharged the soil profile, and depending where you're at, some people continued to get rain throughout the summer. Locally where I'm at, we started to dry up kind of towards the end of June, and we haven't gotten a lot of rain since. But in either way, there's not as much nitrogen left over this year compared to last year, but last year was definitely a big exception. But another thing to think about as we march forward through this fall into next year, high fertilizer prices last year, especially for phosphorus and potassium, did encourage some producers to reduce their P and K rates as much as they could. And one of my concerns is knowing that fertilizer prices are high going into this next fall, is that you can get away kind of trimming back rates for maybe a year or two, but it isn't a long-term strategy because we're still having crop removal from year to year. So I would definitely encourage people to take a deeper look at their immobile nutrient management, particularly phosphorus and potassium, and not try to cut corners, because we're going to need to make sure we allocate those dollars that we do have to play with into the right parts of the field.
Awesome. Is there anything else you've been seeing on your end, Anita? Because I know you work together, so it might be about the same things.
Well, and to be completely honest, we've been in the field basically every day sampling at this point, and we haven't spent a lot of time just yet analyzing those results. So that is to come in the next few days for sure. But we've been really focusing on getting the samples in, so we haven't had a lot of time to really dive into any of those specific results yet. So.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense. So for my last question, what resources are available for farmers who want to start sampling their soil?
Well, I could just jump in here. The couple of programs that we're aware of right now are available through the first one being through the local watershed authority. And I'm not an expert on those programs by any means, but my suggestion would be to reach out to your local rep. But how we are understanding them so far is if it's a new practice to that farm or it's a new practice to those specific fields, and they involve soil mapping or soil sampling, and where there will be a plan put in place to manage nitrogen. There is some funding available. And then the other organization where there is some funding available is also the Canola Council of Canada for folks that are in Canada. And again, not an expert on those programs by any means. Probably would be wise to reach out to somebody with the Canola Council themselves. But it looks like there is some program funding available, again, for new practices to that farm, and I think also involves growing canola on that land, as long as it makes sense rotation-wise. But as far as we know, those are really the two most popular programs right now that are available.
Yeah, so those programs, correct me if I'm wrong, Anita, or misspeak, but those are all geared towards greenhouse gas mitigation, right? Yeah. So I think, more broadly, as far as resources and how to actually get out there and take soil samples, it's something farmers can do themselves. I would say 90% of soil samples that we do get collected are from either a retail agronomist or a crop consultant like Anita. So I would say those would probably be the first two people I'd talk about if you haven't been soil sampling and you want to get into it. Um, Visit with your local retail or a crop consultant, because the important thing is, when you're trying to take soil samples, especially in the northern Great Plains and Canadian prairies, is we collect 2-foot soil samples down to 24 inches for nitrogen management, and that does take some specialized equipment. It requires a hydraulic soil sampling system to really get down there and get good 2-foot samples. So you could either set up your own soil sampling system, but most of these crop consultants and retail locations do have a 2-foot soil sampling system. So they got the equipment to make sure you can get that job done. But beyond that, I mean, there's folks like myself who work in the soil testing industry. And then there's also university extension, or like Manitoba Agriculture, the extension folks there who can also provide some additional resources and guidance on soil sampling and how to get started, and hook you up with somebody who can, either collect the samples, somebody like me who can test the samples, and then usually this person who collects them also helps you interpret them on the backside to get your fertilizer recommendations figured out.
Awesome. Thank you. Those were some awesome resources. And unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, everyone. Thank you so much, Anita and John, for joining me. And I hope everyone in our audience took home some fun knowledge today because I know I did. If you like this topic, make sure to tune in next week where my colleague Mark is talking about fueling plant growth through seed apply technologies. See you then.